The luxury passenger liner set sail on the 10th of April 1912 en route to New York City from South Hampton. The ship was so massive and was built so well that people started calling it Unsinkable. Just 4 days after the ship had sailed, at 20 minutes before midnight, the ship called the Titanic hit an iceberg. The ship was split in two, and in total 1,517 people died. The news shocked the world, but if people had paid attention, they would have known that this disaster was bound to happen. After all, a book had been written predicting exactly what happened to the Titanic 14 years before the Titanic sank. Hello, I'm Nemo, and welcome to episode 11 of Certainly Strange, a podcast about the unexplainable. Today I am covering the predictions of the sinking of the Titanic. I think we are all quite familiar with the story of the Titanic, whether you have seen the movie or not, but I believe not a lot of people are familiar with the books. Yes, multiple, that basically predicted the entire disaster years before it happened. So I thought, you know what, I'd compile them all in an episode here. So without any further ado, let's get into the story. The year was 1898, and author Norman Robertson published a novel called Futility, The Wreck of the Titan. In the book, Robertson tells the tragic story of a ship he called the Titan, taking travellers from South Hampton to New York City. A ship described as unsinkable. Of course, it was not unsinkable, as you might have guessed from the title of the book, but how did it sink? Well, it hit an iceberg. When people started claiming that Robertson was clairvoyant and that he had known about the tragedy of the Titanic through a vision, he simply responded, "No, I know what I'm writing about, that's all." But it all sounded eerily similar. The Titan and the Titanic. They had a similar length, held nearly the same amount of passengers. The iceberg even had the same point of impact on both ships. And there were not enough lifeboats to save all passengers. The Titan had 24 lifeboats, the Titanic only 20. The Wreck of the Titan was not the first or only book to predict the disaster of the Titanic. In 1886, English journalist W.T. Stead wrote a book called The Sinking of a Modern Liner. Like Wreck of the Titan, the story is eerily similar to the true sinking of the Titanic. In the book, an ocean liner departs from Liverpool to New York City. The ship sinks, caused by a collision, but there are too few lifeboats to save the passengers. The strange thing, however, was yet to come. In a strange twist of fate, Stead died when a modern ocean liner sank. An ocean liner called the Titanic. Lastly, there was a short story called The White Ghost of Disaster, written by Thornton Jenkins Haynes in the same year the Titanic set sail. In the story, a ship called the Admiral hits an iceberg at a speed of 22.5 knots, the exact same speed at which the Titanic hit the iceberg. In the story, a great many passengers die. Why? There aren't enough lifeboats. You know, the disaster of the Titanic was not the only historical tragedy that Robertson predicted in a book. In a story published just before he died in 1915, a war breaks out between Japan and the United States when the Japanese bomb US ships. It sounds eerily familiar, doesn't it? After all these years, there are still people who call Robertson clairvoyant, and there are even people who claim that the disaster of the Titanic was a fixed point in time, which is why there were so many people who already knew about it some way or another. Whatever it was, the fact that there are stories so very similar to the true tragedy of the Titanic is certainly strange. So, those were the Titanic predictions. A bit scary, isn't it? I don't think that Robertson or the other writers, any of them, were clairvoyant or anything, or that they were visited by visions of a tragedy already set in time. But I do think, imagine you were a writer and you, like a book you write, manages to predict almost perfectly a huge disaster, one of the biggest disasters in history. I would feel, I don't know, somewhat responsible for it happening. Like you made it happen, like you spoke it into reality, you made it real. I definitely would feel guilty, even though that doesn't really make sense. I mean, imagine if it was possible for people to see the future. It wouldn't be someone's fault that the future decides to happen, but I don't know. It's still strange. I'm sorry, it took a bit of a philosophical turn here. But yes, the predictions of the Titanic sinking. What did you think? I'd love to hear your opinions, as always. You can always contact me or message me on social media. Both the website and my social media are called Dr. Nemo's Cabinet of Curiosities. And thank you for listening to this episode of Certainly Strange, a podcast about the unexplainable. Everything about the podcast and my other projects can be found on my website, drnemoscabinetofcuriosities.com. There you can also find the transcript of this episode and the sources I used in my research. And once again, thanks for listening.